Materials supplied by Microsoft Corporation may be used for internal review, analysis, or research only. Any editing, reproduction, publication, rebroadcast, public showing, internet, or public display is forbidden and may violate copyright law.
Thank you for coming. My name is Amy Draves, and it's my privilege to welcome Graham Simpson to the Microsoft Research Visiting Speaker Series. The Rosie Project is one of my favorite books of the year, telling the sweet story of a man looking for love. Graham lives in Australia with his family and is a former IT consultant, and The Rosie Project is his debut novel and is already a bestseller in multiple countries, and he will be writing a screenplay for the film that's being developed for Sony Pictures. Please join me in giving him a very warm welcome.
Thank you very much, Amy. For the first time in quite a while, I feel like I'm amongst my own people, okay? Because I've come out of an IT background, and I would like to thank Lara and Deb, who are selling the books today, and hiding somewhere there is Gail, my minder, who keeps an eye on me doing all these sorts of things. And of course, Amy, thank you very much for that very nice introduction. Can you hear her right at the back? That's wow! You've got one of those fantastic sound systems that you don't even know it's working, and it actually is, which is fantastic. So let me just start with a short commercial. At some stage, trust me, in the next 12 months, in fact with Christmas coming up, at some stage in the next 3 months, you are going to need to buy a gift for somebody. And you know what a pain that is. You're busy, you're sitting there, you've got work to do, and you've got to buy this gift, you've got to get in the car, you've got to go out, you've got to think, all those annoying sorts of things. Well, let me put it to you, at that point, you'll be thinking to yourself, what can I give them that doesn't cost too much, is personal in some way, has a story, an explanation that goes with it, is, dedicated to them, is going to be appropriate for somebody between the ages of, say, 13 and 92. Just a little aside here, 92 is the oldest person who's read this book and given me positive feedback, and she said, I just love the sexual position scene, okay? So Grandma's going to love this, okay? People who like literary, people who like popular fiction, male or female, what can I give them? You'll think, thank goodness, that day in October at Microsoft, I bought those 5 copies of the Rosie Project, and you just pull one off. So let me just plant that idea in your mind. I will write anything legitimate, legal, in any colour you want on the book to help solve all of your Christmas problems. Okay, so the important thing is we're going to finish by 2:30, okay? And I will allow some time for questions on that. I plan to talk a bit, and I plan to, as I say, allow you do a little bit of reading perhaps as well, just to give you a flavour of the book. For that. How many people have read it? Hands up. Okay, that's great. We're all sort of pretty much in the same boat. So I can do a reading and I won't be telling you stuff you've known before. But let me just give you some sort of position. I was working as a computer operator. This was in the late 1970s. Okay, I'll wind the clock back a little bit. I did a physics degree. So I did, in the 1970s, what people with a physics degree and other useless degrees like mathematics and so forth did. They went into IT, or data processing as it was known then. And I have to tell you, for the young people in the room, that was an incredible time to be in data processing. It's an incredible time now, but it was a different incredible time because there were no programs, no university programs, college programs in computing. So what you had was a bunch of people who came from the widest, amazing range of disciplines who were all, there was no computing people, all just sort of lumped them together, done the 3-week course, and suddenly we were all doing this sort of stuff. And there were a lot of weird people in that stage. Anyway, and I got a job as a computer operator. I had to start at the bottom of the heap loading tapes and lifting, I remember them, 75 megabyte disk packs. It was a big deal. You had to learn how to do a safe lifting course and that to do the 75 megabyte disk packs. And doing that type of work, and I took 6 months off from this arduous work to do a trip around Australia with a buddy in a combi van. And while I was doing that journey, I was reading Henry Miller and Ernest Hemingway, as you do as a young man. I was 21 years old. And I thought, this can't be that hard. So I started scribbling the Great Australian Novel. And I wrote maybe 5 pages. I showed it to my buddy, and he said, Graham, I think you've made an excellent career choice in information technology, and I think you've got a career in that, but don't give up the day job. So realising, and look, I knew myself what I'd written was garbage. It wasn't as easy as it looked, and I proceeded to give up. By the way, if somebody could have tapped me on the shoulder, if my older self could have go back in time and tapped the young Graham on the shoulder and given some advice, he would have said two things. He would have said, Graham, it actually takes time to do this stuff. You want to be, I wanted to be a programmer in those days. You want to be an expert computer programmer? You think you just sit down and say, have I got any talent for this? Nah, I give up. No, you actually have to work at it. And particularly in a very competitive situation like writing, it's going to take a fair time. So don't just sit down and say, talent, no talent. You're going to have to work at it. And the other thing was, don't write about yourself. Look, by the way, is there anybody here who has dreams of writing a novel? Now, what I want you to do is, because you're not going to go, yes, me, or anything like that, you can just sort of go, make some sort of little signal. Those of you who, by the way, greetings, desk people. I know that some people are watching this live at their desks. You don't have to make any signal because I won't see you. But the rest of you, just do it on the count of three. Anybody got an interest in writing a novel? 1, 2, 3. Oh, wow! Okay, a whole bunch of you, which is probably why you come to these sorts of things. So let me just roll the clock forward now. And it's now February of last year. I sat down, I turned on the notebook computer, and I typed the first words of the Rosie Project. Obviously, something had happened in between which enabled me to write what has turned out to be a best-selling novel. Let me tell you, most of what I learned in IT. By definition, because most of the time that I'd spent in the intervening 30 years, I had spent in information technology. So what I'd like to do with you guys is not give my standard spiel, my origin myth about where the book came from in the normal way, but rather try to talk a bit about how my career in information technology taught me stuff that turned out to be really useful. Because when I sat down to write that thing, well, it was a bit like that line in The Bridges of Madison County, that everything that I've ever done in my life has been bringing me to this point. Or if you like a more pragmatic view, you use what you got. And I was going to sit down and I was going to use what I got, and there was enough there that I could actually write a novel. So here I am. Back there, I was an operator. I got promoted to programmer. I moved into the specialist area of database, which was fledgling stuff, DMS2 on the Burroughs 6700. So it wasn't even relational database back in those days. This is sort of CODIS or network databases. And I was the DBA. And one day, the geekiest guy in the whole department, I might add the smartest guy in the whole department, who was predictably the systems programmer, who wrote in DCL in those days. There's a dead language for you. He was the guy. He had the thick glasses. He had the pants around the ankles. And those are the days where you all had to wear ties. He had the pants around the ankles. He had the bowl haircut, all those sorts of things. And he loped over to my desk and he said, Graham, I intend enrolling in a Master of Business Administration. Could have knocked me over with a feather. I mean, the last guy you'd think he'd want to do a Master of Business Administration. I said, why? I mean, I hardly knew this guy. He was a little odd. I wasn't the guy I hung out with. He said, I believe I've been stereotyped as a geek. I intend to acquire the knowledge to overcome that stereotyping. Which, if you haven't sort of picked up on that, is a pretty geeky way of solving the problem. But I said, well, that's real nice. But why are you telling me? And he said, since you suffer from the same problem, I thought you might like to enroll in the course as well. Wake-up calls don't come any stronger than that, let me tell you. So I went off and I enrolled in a Master of Business Administration, continuing to specialise in database work and so forth. And he said to me, he said, since we work together, we should study together. Okay. We will timeshare study with physical fitness. So we would go jogging 6 days a week, And he would have done all the reading you're supposed to be doing, all the pre-reading and so forth, and he would have virtually memorized it. We'd be jogging and he'd be giving me all the stuff about the J-curve and macroeconomics as we ran. One day we ran 13 miles on a Sunday morning to my another buddy's place, where he was going to give me us a ride home. And he took non-stop. We get there and he says, "Not finished, Graham, jog home." So that Sunday morning, we ran a full marathon distance, and it wasn't until the last 5 miles that he finally stopped. So he's a fun guy. But he dropped out of the MBA, but I didn't. And as a result of that, not only did I continue to develop my database skills, and I ended up writing a couple of books on data modeling. So there's a book out there, if you ever see it, called Data Modeling Essentials. It's not the natural companion to the Rosie Project for most people, but maybe for you guys, okay? It's in its 3rd edition, and it's a pretty well-known book on data modeling. So I continued doing that, but I also left my job and went out independent contracting, started to build up a consultancy. And so I got a few management skills. We got 2 in my mid-40s. I was running a consultancy which was doing a range of largely early end of the life cycle type of stuff. So we were doing business process redesign, information systems planning. We'd go as far as specification and project management, but we tended to be software independent. So we were doing that type of work. We had 60, 70 people, offices in 3 cities, tech boom, things were going well, and then I read the book that changed my life. I read a book called The Unkindest Cut by Joe Queenan. And Joe Queenan, American film critic, and this is about how Joe set out to make a movie for $7,000. He was trying to emulate Robert Rodriguez, who famously made a film called El Mariachi in Mexico. Man's nodding. In Mexico, woman's nodding. Everybody's nodding. Who famously made a movie called El Mariachi in Mexico for $7,000, which he raised by selling his own blood. Now, Joe didn't sell his own blood. He used his credit card, but he went out, he wrote the script, he cast his friends, he borrowed equipment, and he kept shoveling money into this thing to make it better. And at the end of it, he'd almost destroyed his marriage. He'd spent $50,000, and he made a complete turkey. So I finished the book, as you do, close it. I said to my wife, "We've got to do this." And she said something like, "What do you mean, we?" And I had a sort of leverage point here, because she had wanted to be a writer. From the age of 8, she'd been filling in exercise books and so on, writing the novel. She'd practiced. She hadn't gone into IT or anything like that. And actually, she'd become a doctor. But she was still writing. She got 2 books to the final hurdle with a major publisher. She had an agent. And then she got a promotion at work and decided she needed to focus on the day job and gave up the writing. I said, "You know, you may never see those novels in print, but imagine seeing one on the big screen." She said, "Is this going to cost anything?" "No, of course it's not going to cost anything. We're going to use our domestic video camera. It's just a little fun thing we do. Well, your book, you will star in it, and we'll cast all our friends. We'll use locations known to us. We'll have the kids in it, the cat, the whole thing. It'll be a time capsule. And on your 40th birthday, we will show this movie, and that will give us something to do on your 40th birthday, time capsule." And she said, "Are you sure it won't cost anything?" I said, "Of course it's not going to cost anything. Domestic video camera, cast our friends." "Okay." I think she said, "Okay." But then entered into it with great enthusiasm. It took me 4 months to write the screenplay, which I did. And then we shot it with all friends and that sort of thing. And to cut a long story short, it's a very long story, on her 40th birthday, 9 months later, at 2 a.m, we finished the final edit. And that night, 300 of us piled into a movie theatre, which we had hired. You hired a movie theatre. What did that cost? Didn't matter anymore. We'd spent so much already. Yeah. So, and we watched this film, and people watched it. It was a drama, and they didn't laugh in the wrong places, and that should have been the end of it. Except that the person who directed it, who I may well see tonight because she lives in Portland, Oregon, and that's where I'm going, the person who directed it took it along to her film class. She was a film student. And the teacher said, the instructor said, "You know," because I went along too, "there's a lot of things wrong with this movie, like the acting and things like that." But she said, "You know, you said you spent more money than you intended on it. The smartest money you spent was using a professional screenwriter." And a very dangerous seed was planted. And a year later, I had sold my business. And I would like to say, and naturally, I immediately enrolled. By the way, I went freelancing. So I continued doing freelance masterclasses on consulting skills, because I'd learned a bit about that, and on data modeling. All around the world, I was all over the US doing just like this tour at the moment, except the topic was data modeling. And I've got to tell you, talking about my book is a lot more fun. But I continued doing that, and I would like to say I went straight into an undergrad class in screenwriting, but I didn't. I had a bucket list problem. I always wanted a PhD. So I thought, let's get that done first. So I went back to school and I did a PhD in data modeling. And what that took me into, the question I was asking was, people familiar with entity relationship modeling, that sort of stuff, right? The question I was asking is, when people do entity relationship modeling, are they doing description or design? Are they describing something in the user's heads, or are they coming up with something? So I did the biggest study ever of data modeling practitioners, over 479 data modeling practitioners that I interviewed or got them to do exercises and all this. And because I was trying to say, were we doing design when we did data modeling, I had to learn about design theory. So I learned all this stuff about general design theory, which is a theory which comes out of architecture, particularly engineering. And the conclusion after 4 years of work is data modeling is design. So I got my PhD with those 4 words and walked away feeling I had wasted 4 years of my life, because I now enrolled in the undergraduate course program in screenwriting, straight from PhD to diploma. So it was a little bit of a come down. But I was to find that the stuff I had learned in my PhD about design theory turned out to be remarkably useful. That in fact, you could look at screenwriting as being a design process. Now, so when I started, well, I better tell you what, when I started doing screenwriting, we were doing things like, I'm thinking of some principles of design that I could draw on. We were doing things like putting scenes on cards, working top down. And you'd put all the scenes on cards and you'd shuffle them around on the wall. They call it doing the cards. Okay? And then one of the students would say that I was working with would say, hang on, I got a great idea for scene 17. And someone would say, no, we're just doing the cards, so it's top down. But one of the things you learn in design theory is that design is never purely top down. It's always a bit top down, a bit bottom up, a bit middle out. So I would say, no, it's okay. Let's turn the card over. Let's grab that clever idea for that scene. Let's keep it. Let's turn the card back over. Now, what was going on in my mind, in a way, was screenwriting, problem comes up, apply general design theory, but more than just applying it like I've read a book, I actually felt like I had experience in it. Because even though I was in a different field, designing databases or doing data modeling, or business process design, which I also did quite a lot of, those cards felt like a business process. I just felt like I'd been there before. You had to learn something a little new, but I had a sense, like being able to program in one language and learning another. You've been there before, your learning curve is just so much faster than somebody who's learning programming for the first time. Or the idea that design is never finished. When you've got a design, you can always make it better. So while I was in this course, a screenwriting guru came to Australia and he said, you should never spend more than 3 months on a screenplay. And if you spend a year, it's just because you're no good. Except design theory said the opposite. Design theory said, put it down, leave it for a while, come back, you can make it better. So which did I believe? Because all around me, students were abandoning their screenplays. That's the advice, chuck it, start another one. I spent 5 years on my one screenplay, and that turned out to be the smart move. And things like design solutions lead to new design problems, inevitably. Or almost inevitably. So when someone says, I got a solution to that scene, the fact that he's not supposed to meet the girl yet, why don't we make him do this? No, but that'll create another problem. Now, people would stop and say, oh, it's going to create another problem, forget it. Design theory says, of course it will. Solve that problem. That'll create a problem too, maybe. Solve that. Eventually you get to the end of a chain. So it's a way of working that I'd struck in IT all the time. You find a solution to something, it creates its own problem. You don't give up and say, well, that's no good a solution. So I had all this sort of experience. Of course, what I actually needed was a topic, a subject. And again, IT helped enormously, because I thought, what will I write about? They say good story comes out of character. All the people in my course had come out of the arts. I was the only guy, I was one other guy who'd come out of IT. Thought, well, if I want to do something different, let's write about an IT type of character, somebody I'd have worked with. And I remember my friend who I was still jogging with all these years later, even after he dropped out of the MBA, we just kept on jogging. I thought, maybe take a character like him, the sort of uber geek, and let's make him the subject of the story. So my very first class, they said, all right, what we want you to do is to take a character and write a short story. What? I thought we were doing screenwriting. No, we don't want you to learn the method yet. Write the short story. So that week, I invented a story about a guy called Don Tillman. I made him a professor of physics rather than an IT person, just to be a little different, and because I'd studied physics. This was going to be, my idea for the movie was going to be a drama. So I wrote a little story about my character, Don Tillman, the physicist, and I based it on something that happened with me and my buddy at one stage, and it's called The Jacket Incident. It's about a guy turning up at a restaurant where you have to wear a jacket, but he's wearing a hiking jacket. And he gets into a little trouble with this, okay? And so what happens, I've taken this along to school. Oh, before I even took it along to school, I showed it to someone else, because this is the first fiction writing, other than adapting my wife's work, that I had done since school, so in 30 years. So I was a little nervous about it being shown to a whole bunch of people who were better at this. So I showed it to someone and said, oh yes, that's a story about a guy with Asperger's syndrome, is it? I guess. I've met a lot of people like that. They've never been diagnosed with Asperger's, but I guess. So I took it to class and I said, this is a story about a guy with Asperger's syndrome. You know what? All they wanted to do was talk about Asperger's syndrome. They said, oh, Asperger's syndrome? Then why is he going on a date? Oh yeah, I made the story that he, instead of going out with a buddy, he went out on a date. It's his first date. He's wearing the wrong jacket. Things escalate. Luckily, he's got martial arts skills. things get a little out of control, but the date sort of works out happily, and he's moved on in his life. I said, would he be going on a date? I thought that guys like that didn't like connection with other people. Oh, he's drinking. I don't think people with Asperger's drink. Right. And, oh, is he wearing socks? Somebody told me that Asperger's don't like the feeling of socks against their skin, so they don't wear socks. So they don't wear socks. And all they wanted to do was talk about Asperger's syndrome. So I decided, forget it. We're never going to say this guy has Asperger's syndrome again. The other weird thing was they all laughed. They're all killing themselves laughing. I said, look, there's a little light relief here, but it's not meant to be a comedy. Well, as I developed my story, which was about a guy searching for a wife, but doing it the only way he knew how, geeky, scientific, sort of rational way, this drama, which was going to be called The Face of God, because you'd learn about physics, and morphed into being called The Clara Project, I discovered that people were laughing more than I wanted. You'd say, hey, that was meant to be the light relief, not the whole point of it. And my comedy teacher took me aside and he said, Graham, he said, if you are gifted with a character who can make people laugh, don't waste it on drama. It's much harder to write comedy than drama. TV comedy writers get paid double what drama writers get paid. He says, get out there and use this guy. And I thought, well, hang on. Are we laughing at a disability here? Now that people have mentioned the A word, are we saying this guy's got Asperger's and we're laughing at Asperger's? And my answer was, this guy is different. Sure, he's different. But he's not different in a way that's worse. It's the same, if I was Chinese, I'm standing at the front and I didn't speak English, I'd be in heaps of trouble here. I'd be disabled, disadvantaged. But not because Chinese isn't as good as English, just because I'm around a bunch of people who only speak English. If you go to China, you have the same problem, unless you speak Chinese, okay? So I was saying, this is sort of a fish out of water situation. It's not because English is better, it's just because this guy has got a different set of skills, he's wired in a different way. He doesn't want to be different. Yeah? My dad can barely walk. He's disabled. He doesn't want to be like that. My hero, Don Tillman, doesn't want to be any different from what he is. He would like the world to be a bit different, but that's the way. So we're not laughing that way. But then people say, are we laughing with him or at him? I'll put it this way, neither. Imagine I tell you a joke. I say, 3 people walk into a pub, an Englishman, an American, and an Australian. You know it's going to be a joke about the Australian, don't you? The Australian came third because the Englishman and the American are going to do similar sorts of things or consistent things, and the Australian is going to switch it all around and reverse it. Now, you don't know whether it's going to be to his or her advantage or disadvantage. You might end up saying, what an idiot that Australian was, didn't get it. Or you might say, what an idiot the American and the Brit were. You don't know. It's the unexpected that we laugh at. This is a knife. We laugh at the unexpected. So that's what's happening. Don is a guy who generates the unexpected. He's also an observational comedy guy because if I stand up here and typical observational comedy stuff, what's this about? What's it about, having to wear a jacket into a restaurant? Now, of course, the guy does know what it's about, having to wear a jacket into a restaurant, but he's pretending to be the person from Mars. Don is the person from Mars. Don really doesn't get it, and you're getting observational comedy about the world that we live in, about the way we do things, and the lack of rationality sometimes behind that. So I had my character, Don. I had the Clara Project, and I worked on that using a lot of design skills, also a lot of team skills. Screenwriting is frequently done in team-type environments where there's 2 or 3 of you working together. You talk about writers' rooms and so on. If you've worked in an IT environment where you're expected to be egoless, but where you're expected to work in teams, to have your work reviewed by other people, then it's a very natural way of working. Those sorts of skills transfer forward. Anyway, to cut a long story short, the movie script went through 5 years of modifications, during which it went from being the Clara Project to the Rosie Project. There's a design rule that says something like, design solutions often require holistic change, meaning structural change. And there was an awful moment after 2.5 years where I threw the whole thing in the trash and only pulled out Don Tillman and the jacket incident, which I had retained, left Clara in the trash, invented a new protagonist, new love interest called Rosie. So there was some pretty hard pain to go through, but I figured that it had been a learning experience and that subconsciously I would still bring a lot of stuff forward. So in the end, I had this detailed screenplay, and I found myself a producer in New York. The producer couldn't raise the money. So I got the screenplay back, and I then found the producer in Australia. Producer couldn't raise the money. So here we are at the beginning of last year, and I said to her, would it help if I wrote this as a novel instead of a screenplay? Would that generate some interest? And she said, Graham, only if it was a bestseller. Why not? And I sat down to try to write the Rosie Project as a novel. And as I said, it was a little bit like all the things I'd learned came to fruition there. What do you need to write a novel? Well, you certainly need to be able to write a sentence. Okay, you need to be able to write, I'd written so many reports, so many consulting proposals, plus academic papers, PhD thesis, 2 books on data modelling. I could write a clear sentence. I could communicate. Okay, so that was a good start. You need to have a story. I had a story, and what's interesting is that that story had come out of design. I had designed a story. Screenwriting is full of rules, of structure. If you read books like Sid Field's book, Screenplay, it's all about, on page 25, the following should happen. By page 10, we need to have met the protagonist, and we have the inciting incident. At the end of the second act, all will be lost. But the protagonist will realise that they were after something more important than what they originally set out to get. They will go out seeking that. We'll be rooting for them, blah, blah, blah. All these rules. It's just like, it feels a lot like any sort of design process. So here I had a screenplay that was designed sitting there, very detailed story, complete with characters, dialogue, and so forth. You also need a skill, which is the one that most novelists fall down on. You need the ability to manage a big project. A lot of novelists can write 1,500 words of beautiful prose, or 3,000, but 80,000 words, they get lost. It's all over the place. It's a mess. They can't handle it. They keep writing little bits and pieces. Well, I'd written my data modelling book, 130,000 words now. I'd worked on a PhD thesis. I had done big programs, big databases. I was used to dealing with big things that were more than you could hold in memory at one given time, and you had to keep paging out and doing those sorts of things. So I could do all of that. What I didn't have was what was in my man's head. And all the rest was in the screenplay. But I'd been living with this character for 5 years. I had a pretty good idea of what was in his head. And I sat down, and with all of that stuff, some of which had come out of design, I sat down and I wrote the novel. I wrote a draft of the novel in 4 weeks, like that. I spent 3 weeks tidying it up and sent it to some publishers. I also entered a competition, which I was fortunate enough to win. The publishers got interested. Life went on from there. So, well, okay, the big moment, publisher offered me an advance for the book. I had 4 publishers bidding, so I was able to get a pretty good advance. I got 1.8 million, I think. I'm kidding. Okay. I'm in Australia. I got 3 days consulting fees. Okay, so it wasn't going to change my life. But in September of last year, so not long ago, my wife and I were doing a walk across England from coast to coast, at the narrowest point, obviously. 16 days, though. And just before we started, my publisher called me up on the cell phone and said, Graham, we're going to take your book to the Frankfurt Book Fair, which is where all the foreign rights get sold. I said, cool, what does that mean? And he said, well, I knew sort of what it meant. He said, well, at the moment, we're just going to send it out to all of the scouts and agents. They will read it, decide whether any of their publishing clients might be interested. It'll take 6 weeks, and then at the actual book fair, we might get an offer. Cool. Nothing to lose. So we start walking. 3 days into the walk, we haven't had any cell phone reception. We're up in the Lake District of England. There's a warning for you. And we come into reception area and suddenly, boom, 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 all these messages. Graham, please call. Graham, call me. Call me urgently. I need to make a decision. I had to make a decision. Oh, call him back. What happened? 48 hours after it went out, a German publisher had read it and offered an advance for the German translation rights. 6 figures, euros, 24 hours, take it or leave it. I was about to learn the publishing industry, they're drama queens. You work in business, I mean, you've got the business side of what you do and so forth, and business deals are not made like they're made on television. They're made by people sitting down relatively calmly, going through contracts, lawyers, all that sort of stuff. It's not, take it or leave it, we'll auction it. But the publishing trade doesn't know that, and they run it like it is in movies. So once it was out there, there was this feeding frenzy, and over the rest of the walk, every morning I'm on Skype in some corner of a pub that's got Wi-Fi going, what, is that yen or is it dollars? And my wife's going, oh. But at the end of the walk, we had 12 deals signed up, including all the big players. Simon Schuster in the USA, I was delighted that they won a 3.5-day auction with the most arcane rules about how you go about doing it. But watch the drama, they won that. And we had another dozen or so offers on the table that were just still escalating and more stuff to come. And I was able to order a beer and say, not that you would ever want this to happen to you, goodbye to the day job. And off it went. So I was out of IT at the end of last year. And since then, we have sold the film rights, as Amy mentioned, and life has continued on. The book was published only 2 weeks ago. In the USA, so I'm sort of watching it crawl up Amazon. We're just at sort of about 100 on Amazon, but it's an indie bookseller's book. It's already sort of hitting the top 20 in the indie list, and I hopefully it'll carry on like that. So, I want to do a reading for you. I thought I might do a slightly longer reading than I normally do. Is that okay? All right. So, this is Don Tillman. Oh, Don Tillman morphed from being a physicist into a geneticist in the story, okay? So he's now a geneticist, but I gave him a first degree in computer science. I thought that was important to just show. But he decided he didn't want to be a computer science geek, so he became a genetics geek, okay? So this is Don, and he's been asked to give this is going to take about 5-6 minutes, okay? Don has been asked to give a talk on Asperger's syndrome by his buddy Gene, who thinks it would be a good idea for Don to give a talk on Asperger's syndrome because he might learn something. 2 lunchtimes were sufficient to research and prepare my lecture on Asperger's syndrome without sacrificing nourishment, thanks to the provision of Wi-Fi in the Medical Library Cafe. I had no previous knowledge of autism spectrum disorders, as they were outside my specialty. The subject was fascinating. It seemed appropriate to focus on the genetic aspects of the syndrome, which might be unfamiliar to my audience. Most diseases have some basis in our DNA, though in many cases we have yet to discover it. My own work focuses on genetic predisposition to cirrhosis of the liver. Much of my working time is devoted to getting mice drunk. Naturally, the books and research papers describe the symptoms of Asperger's syndrome, and I formed a provisional conclusion that most of these were simply variations in human brain function that had been inappropriately medicalised because they did not fit social norms, constructed social norms that reflected the most common human configurations rather than the full range. The lecture was scheduled for 7 p.m. at an inner suburban school. I estimated the cycle ride at 12 minutes and allowed 3 minutes to boot my computer and connect it to the projector. I arrived on schedule at 6:57 p.m, having let Eva, the short-skirted cleaner, into my apartment 27 minutes earlier. There were approximately 25 people milling around the door and the front of the classroom, but I immediately recognised Julie, the convener, from Jean's description, blonde with big tits. In fact, her breasts were probably no more than 1.5 standard deviations from the mean size for her body weight, and hardly a remarkable identifying feature. It was more a question of elevation and exposure as a result of her choice of costume, which seemed perfectly practical for a hot January evening. We're in Australia. I may have spent too long verifying her identity, as she looked at me strangely. "You must be Julie," I said. "Can I help you?" "Good, a practical person." "Yes, direct me to the VGA cable, please." "Oh," she said, "you must be Professor Tillman. I'm so glad you could make it." She extended her hand, but I waved it away. "The VGA cable, please. It's 6:58. "Relax," she said. "We never start before 7:15. Would you like a coffee?" Why do people value others' time so little? Now we would have the inevitable small talk. I could have spent 15 minutes at home practicing Aikido. I had been focusing on Julie and the screen at the front of the room. Now I looked around and realised that I had failed to observe 19 people. They were children, predominantly male, sitting at desks. Presumably these were the victims of Asperger's syndrome. Almost all the literature focuses on children. Despite their affliction, they were making better use of their time than their parents, who were chattering aimlessly. Most were operating portable computing devices. I guess their ages are between 8 and 13. I hope they had been paying attention in their science classes, as my material assumed a working knowledge of organic chemistry and the structure of DNA. I realised that I had failed to reply to the coffee question. No. Unfortunately, because of the delay, Julie had forgotten the question. "No coffee," I explained. "I never drink coffee after 3:48 p.m. It interferes with sleep. Caffeine has a half-life of 3 to 4 hours, so it's irresponsible serving coffee at 7 p.m. unless people are planning to stay awake until after midnight, which doesn't allow adequate sleep if they have a conventional job." I was trying to make use of the waiting time by offering practical advice, but it seemed that she preferred to discuss trivia. "Is Jean all right?" she said. It was obviously a variant on the most common of formulaic interactions. "How are you?" "He's fine, thank you," I said, adapting the conventional reply to the third-person form. "Oh, I thought he was ill." "Jean is in excellent health, except for being 6 kilograms overweight. We went for a run this morning. He has a date tonight, and he wouldn't be able to go if he was ill." Julie seemed unimpressed, and in reviewing the interaction later, I realised that Jean must have lied to her about his reason for not being present. This was presumably to protect Julie from feeling that her lecture was unimportant to Jean, and to provide a justification for a less prestigious speaker being sent as a substitute. It seems hardly possible to analyse such a complex situation involving deceit, supposition of another person's emotional response, and then prepare your own plausible lie, all while someone is waiting for you to reply to a question. Yet that is exactly what people expect you to be able to do. Eventually I set up my computer and we got started 18 minutes late. I would need to speak 43% faster to finish on schedule at 8 p.m, a virtually impossible performance goal. We were going to finish late and my schedule for the rest of the night would be thrown out. I'll give you just a little more. I had titled my talk "Genetic Precursors to Autism Spectrum Disorders" and sourced some excellent diagrams of DNA structures. I had only been speaking for 9 minutes, a little faster than usual to recover time, when Julie interrupted. "Professor Tillman, most of us here are not scientists, so you may need to be a little less technical." This sort of thing is incredibly annoying. People can tell you the supposed characteristics of a Gemini or a Taurus and will spend 5 days watching a cricket match, but cannot find the interest or the time to learn the basics of what they, as humans, are made up of. I continued with my presentation as I had prepared it. It was too late to change, and surely some of the audience were informed enough to understand. I was right. A hand went up, a male of about 12. "You are saying that it is unlikely that there is a single genetic marker, but rather that several genes are implicated and the aggregate expression depends on their specific combination? Affirmative. Exactly. Plus environmental factors. The situation is analogous to bipolar disorder, which Julie interrupted again. So for us non-geniuses, I think Professor Tillman is reminding us that Asperger's is something you're born with. It's nobody's fault. I was horrified by the use of the word fault with its negative connotations, especially as it was being employed by someone in authority. I abandoned my decision not to deviate from the genetic issues. The matter had doubtless been brewing in my unconscious, and the volume of my voice may have increased as a result. Fault! Asperger's isn't a fault, it's a variant. It's potentially a major advantage. Asperger's syndrome is associated with organisation, focus, innovative thinking, and rational detachment. A woman at the rear of the room raised her hand. I was focused on the argument now and made a minor social error, which I quickly corrected. The fat woman, overweight woman at the back. She paused and looked around the room, then continued. Rational detachment. Is that a euphemism for lack of emotion? Synonym, I required. Emotions can cause major problems. I decided it would be helpful to provide an example, drawing on a story in which emotional behaviour would have led to disastrous consequences. Imagine, I said, you're hiding in a basement. The enemy is searching for you and your friends. Everyone has to keep totally quiet, but your baby is crying. I did an impression, as Jean would, to make the story more convincing. Wah! I paused dramatically. You have a gun. Hands went up everywhere. Julie jumped to her feet as I continued. With a silencer. They're coming closer. They're going to kill you all. What do you do? The baby's screaming. The kids couldn't wait to share their answer. One called out, shoot the baby! And soon they were all shouting, shoot the baby, shoot the baby! The boy who had asked the genetics question called out, shoot the enemy! And then another said, ambush them! The suggestions were coming rapidly. Use the baby as bait. How many guns do we have? Cover its mouth. How long can it live without air? As I'd expected, all the ideas came from the Asperger's sufferers. The parents made no constructive suggestions. Some even tried to suppress their children's creativity. I raised my hands. Time's up. Excellent work. All the rational solutions came from the Aspies. Everyone else was incapacitated by emotion. There you go, Australian accent and all. Okay. If you like audiobooks, by the way, the audio version of this is read by an Australian. His name's Dan O'Grady, which you might think is Irish, but he's well and truly Australian, so he sounds awfully like me, I'm afraid. So, guys, we've got 15 minutes and 8 seconds for questions. If anybody would like to talk, ask questions.
So are you planning another book?
Am I planning another book? Yeah, look.
Or are you going to use the same design process?
Yeah, good question. Am I planning another book? Will I use the same design process? Not as... I've written 2 more books drafted, and I'm working on a third, which will in fact be the next book, and it'll be a sequel to the Rosie Project. So the other 2. And did I use the same design process? I didn't actually go as far as a screenplay, but yes, I used all the screenwriting processes to come up with story. So I'm now someone who uses consciously design processes for story. It's interesting, there's these 2 different cultures. Both screenwriters and novelists have to come up with story. But novelists do it in a garret by themselves, and screenwriters do it in a collaborative situation. My observation is you get better story out of a collaborative situation. The screenwriters, in my humble opinion, are better at story. And the novelists frequently do, they have beautiful prose sometimes, but one of the criticisms, particularly of much literary fiction, is that the story doesn't hold up as well as it could. So yeah, I'm using the same process to get tight story. Yeah. Somebody moved? No? Yep.
What are some of your favorite actors or writers in comedy? And what do you think of Jerry Seinfeld? Because he does a lot of observational comedy.
Yeah. I mean, I've got to tell you, I hardly watched any television or went to any movies while I was studying screenwriting, which sounds a little crazy, but I only did the stuff I had to do for school because I had a day job and I was trying to get the level of expertise. Look, if there was one lesson I took, which I didn't mention, from my previous career, it takes a long time to get seriously good at something. And I figured I would have to spend as much time on screenwriting as on data modelling to get to that level that I'd been at. So I just didn't watch TV except what I had to and so on. But I have seen Seinfeld. Haven't been actually living in in a cave for all of that time. Yeah, I love Seinfeld. I love observational comedy. People often ask, which actor would you like to play Don Tillman? And I mean, the sort of Washington Post, which gave a very nice review last Sunday, I think it was, last weekend, said Paul Rudd. Steve Carell is a name that comes up. It's what you sort of expect. But I learnt making a lot of short films during my screenwriting learning that, that sometimes a great casting director can cast against type, can give you someone you'd never think of. Russell Crowe in A Beautiful Mind. I mean, who would have thunk it? And yet, they can be the stunning sorts of results. So, yeah. I've got one here, one there. You're first.
So how closely involved are you to the adaptation of the book?
How closely involved am I to the adaptation?
Since you spent your whole life getting to this point and writing this book, I'm guessing you want to be close to the film adaptation? I mean,
yeah, how close do I want to be to the film adaptation? I'll tell you, most authors, in my observation, want to be close to the screen adaptation of the book so they don't ruin it, okay? So they're in control freak mode, okay? This is my ego, this is perfect, do not ruin a thing. And they've got a whole bunch of producers everywhere, they just try to fend off, unsuccessfully, always. Yeah, and less and less and less. Maybe if you are E.L. James, 50 Shades of Grey, or J.K. Rowling, you are so powerful that you can do that. But for most writers, most authors, they're fighting a losing battle. My story is totally different. I wrote the screenplay first. So when the studios came a-knocking and said, we'd like to adapt your book, I said, oh, matter of fact, I've got a screenplay right here in my back pocket. And they said, isn't that sweet? We'd like to adapt your book. And we will get our favourite screenwriter in to do that. And I had an agent by this stage, and the agent said, that's the way they work. I said, well, I guess they won't get the screenplay, they won't get the book, will they? He said, oh, send us in the screenplay, looked at it, said, oh, it's okay. Yes, I spent 5 years on it. It was my primary deliverable before it got translated, as it were. And so I got the screenwriting gig. Sony Pictures agreed to the screenwriting gig. I get 2 redrafts, which means with their input, I can do two further drafts. At that point, they're free to bring on other writers, but the credit, I get paid for the screenwriting, the credit would be arbitrated by the Writers Guild of America if there was any dispute about how much is me, how much is somebody else. I'm very happy with that arrangement. But unlike most authors, I mean, I've got the screenplay here, and I understand that filmmaking is a collaborative enterprise. It's like putting, look at it, it's like getting a new application in. Someone's going to design the database, someone's going to write the code, someone's going to design the user interface. You're all going to have to work together to get this sucker done, and you're going to have to make some compromises, and someone's going to say, if you fully normalize a thing, it's not going to perform. And you say, oh, whatever it's going to be, and you're going to have to slug that out. And the film producer's going to say, you want it set in New York City, we can't afford to film this thing in New York City. We can't have that shot that you want, or whatever. Sometimes it's that. Sometimes it's, we've got to have baseball in it, whatever it's got to be. It's, our sponsor wants them to drive a BMW, who knows. But I'm used to working that collaborative thing. I feel I've made my artistic statement, my solo artistic statement with the book, and now I'm looking forward to collaborating with these guys. And so far, I think they were a little surprised. They may be watching this recording, but I think they were a little surprised when I turned up and didn't say, don't touch the book. In fact, the first thing they said was, I wonder what would happen if we took this scene out. They said, how close, well, that was my favourite scene in the whole book. But instead of saying, no, don't touch that scene, it's the best scene in the book, why do you want to take it out? They explained, we talked about it, we did some design work, and the next morning, 3 of us came back with the same answer to how we could move that scene and make the whole thing work better. So I enjoy that. I enjoy that, but it does mean letting go and saying, this is a collaboration. And again, it's something I learnt in IT. They don't teach you that in novel writing courses. Yeah. Yes?
You were mentioning drama earlier, and I'm curious if you now feel like you're stuck in, because you're very funny. So I'm wondering if you're stuck in a comedy niche.
Yeah, look, one of the worries I had, let me tell you, when you've got a couple of million in advances, you don't worry too much about being stuck in a groove at this point. You're saying, whoa, suddenly I'm living the dream. I'm able to give up my day job, I'm able to be a full-time novelist. But there is a concern that you get typecast, that you can only write comedy. And let me tell you, I'm not sure I can write comedy if Don Tillman isn't in it. Very few writers, I think, are gifted more than one comedic character in a lifetime. It takes this talent to do that, and another level of talent to be able to make up new comedic characters routinely. I mean, the screenwriting analogy is, if I was asked to write an episode of The Simpsons, could I do it? Yeah, I could. I'm not saying it'd be the greatest episode ever, but I could do that. If I was asked to invent a set of characters as good as The Simpsons, could I do it? Not even close. Not even close. So it's, once you've got the character, I think of John Mortimer in Rumpole the Bailey or something like that, if you read that type of stuff, or the characters in sitcoms that just get used over and over again. But I wrote a short story about the same time as the Rosie Project came out, and it was a drama. It's actually up on the net. It's called, pretentiously, 3 Encounters with the Physical. It's about a guy running a marathon. It's actually me. Okay? It's about a guy running a marathon, almost dying running a marathon. So it's quite dramatic. It's quite stylistic in that it uses first, second, and third person, past, present, and future tenses. So it's quite writerly, quite literary in its own way. And that came second in a competition and got published all over the country because it was one of the major newspapers runs it. So that was fantastic to just have something in there as a brand new writer nobody ever heard of, to say, not only you got the book, but here's a little thing that says I can do other stuff. Something you learn in creativity, by the way, in creativity theory, which I learned, it ties in with design, is the great artists tend to do a lot of stuff. They tend to have very high outputs, some of which is garbage. Any Bob Dylan fans here? Yeah. Not all of Bob Dylan's work is great, unless you're a really, really rusted on Bob Dylan fan. But he's very prolific. Same with Picasso. These people who are at the top of their games just did a lot of stuff. They kept doing it, and some was good, some wasn't so hot. You do lots. Yep.
I had a question about the condition of the main character.
Yep.
Do you have feedback from people who are sensitive to the fact or perceiving that it's...
Yeah, the Asperger's thing.
And how do you respond to that?
Okay, the Asperger's community, the day I launched, okay, go back. Before I even published the book, the third person to read the book, the first person outside my family, was my buddy who had inspired the Don Tillman character. And I asked him how he felt about the book. He said, it's the greatest book I've ever read. I have tears in my eyes, it should get a Nobel Prize. So that was a good start. Well, he related to the character. You could see where he was coming from. But it was positive because it's written in first person. I got some endorsement. I actually managed to get inside the head reasonably successfully. Then I sent it out knowingly to, I think, 4 people who had kids with Asperger's syndrome, and one who identifies as having Asperger's syndrome herself, and unknowingly to 2 other people who had kids with Asperger's syndrome. They were beta readers who I just didn't know had kids with Asperger's syndrome. 100% positive feedback from them because the Asperger's guy is the hero. But then on the launch night of the book, I'm up there, finished the launch, bookshop, loads of people, friends and family. The first person who walks up to me says, "Hi, my name's Dan. I've got Asperger's syndrome and I've got a problem with your book." "What's the problem?" And he says, "On page 22, Don Tillman says, I don't want a woman who's mathematically illiterate. The correct word is enumerate. Don Tillman would not make that mistake." And I was able to say, well, actually, people in math, any mathematicians here? Yeah, mathematicians will actually use the term illiterate to mean something broader than enumerate. Not because you can't add up, you can't even do calculus, you moron. So he said, "Oh, that's fine then, I'll have 3 copies." So that was, and why 3? And he said, because I want to give it to my friends to show what it's like to have Asperger's syndrome. So, and the most moving comment I've had about the book was someone who asked me to sign the book. She said, my brother was diagnosed in his 40s with Asperger's syndrome. He'd always struggled in life. He'd never been able to keep a job, but now we had a name for it. And the family, in supporting him, all went out and bought books on Asperger's syndrome and tried to learn as much as they could. And then he died. And afterwards, she said, it was only after he died and we read the Rosie Project that we had an idea of what it must have been like for him, which I was enormously flattered by. But the thing is, most articles on Asperger's by people much more expert than I am. I have not studied it. I've read it a bit now because I've had to, because people ask these questions. But not the Don Tillman character came out of people I knew in IT and academe. And there's a Don Tillman in every math department, every physics department. Yeah, they came out of that, not out of any book on Asperger's syndrome. But now that I've read up on it, it's all saying, we observe this. People with Asperger's do that. Not, this is the way they think, this is what's going on, this is what it's like to be it. So that was, and I've always said, up until recently, I'm not a people say, does Don actually have Asperger's? And I say, how do I know? I'm not a psychologist. But one of the world experts on Asperger's and I had lunch together. And Professor Tony Atwood, Asperger's guru, said, Graham, Don Tillman has Asperger's. So he's been diagnosed now. He's on the spectrum. If I ever get problems with it, it's people who've got kids who've got autism. Serious, hard autism. And now, because Asperger's is seen by psychiatrists at least as being part of the autism spectrum, then they say, well, Don's autistic then. He's on the spectrum. And you could be Don and totally functional. I swear, you will work with people who are as Asperger as Don, and they have families, they have good relationships, they hold down jobs, they're happy with their lives. But if you're working in Microsoft Research, I'm sure you've got people around you who work. I've certainly in IT and academia had those people. And that's the Don Tillman of the book. We're laughing with him. We're not laughing at some kid who can't speak. It's a completely different thing, a different level. Yep, probably last question actually.
Did your buddy know that the Don Tillman character was based on him when he read the book?
Well, he said at first, well, it can't be based on me. It's not called Don. I said, well, my name's not Don. But I said, obviously, this incident, yeah, it was different. You got the apricot ice cream disaster. When it happened to me, it was peach. So everybody's got an ice cream disaster in their lives. Presumably you had a vanilla ice cream disaster. What was your flavour of your ice cream disaster? But his family said to him, that's you. But it isn't. Because I've had a bunch of other people come up to me and say, you based Don on my dad, didn't you? You based Don on this person. Are you sure? I had someone turn up at a session and said, I came to ask you the hard question, did you base Don on my brother? Because her brother had worked with me. So there's a fair bit of Don around there. People say it's like being in Sheldon Cooper's head. So, you get that question. I say a character, I've heard this said by others, a character is a third someone you know, a third yourself, I obviously had to inhabit the guy, and a third you make up. I think that's pretty true of Don Tillman. Yeah. So there's no live Don Tillman out there. Sad for some women who write to me and say I'm in love with Don Tillman. Truly. Okay, I look at the time. First rule of public speaking, always finish on time. I'll be delighted to answer further questions over your freshly purchased copy of the Rosie Project. So thank you very much.